What is going on, everybody? So glad to be back. A lot of things that have been missed in the time that I've been gone. If you watched last episode, you saw Cease in a debate that was, in my opinion, very weak. all right, I'll stop with the dad jokes. But yeah, it was an interesting argument. I actually did talk, or I'm sorry, I did backup for Talk Heathen, in which I never actually got on because we didn't have power outages this time, like when I was on, and then did Atheist Experience, and he called in. The guy that Cease had debated actually called in, so you can go back and watch if that's your thing, and go watch Kenneth and other people talk to him about the same weak argument. But anyway, that out of the way, Cease, what is going on today? What are we getting into? And maybe you give us a rundown and then introduce the guest.
Well, yeah. So real quick, did you watch it yet or no?
I haven't, because I'm going to do a review on it.
Okay.
And it's going to be a blind review, and so I'm not going to watch it. Yeah.
Dumbest conversation I've ever been a part of. Like, it was horrible.
I know the argument, so I know already kind of what the argument is, but yeah, well, I haven't actually seen your guys' conversation about the argument.
So for today, we're bringing on David Cal Johnson. He's a philosophy professor. I believe at King's College. That's what he said. And we're going to talk to him about the role of religion in society, whether or not we may also stray into some conversation about meta ethics potentially. I want to ask him. I know he's written about the Kalam Argument. He's written about fine-tuning. I think he's written about the morality of holding religious beliefs, and I want to get his thoughts on all those things. And so I'm excited to have him on. We had a conversation last on a different show, the Secular Soapbox, where we talked about the meaning of life, and that's where we met. And I thought he would be a good guest to bring on here to have a conversation with. So you can bring him in.
Without further ado,
how's it going, guys?
Great.
Great.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It should be fun.
So I guess to start, if you could give us a little bit of your background and what your interests in philosophy are.
Yeah. So I'm a professor of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. It's a small Catholic liberal arts college. I, however, am an atheist teaching there at the Catholic College. There are plenty of atheists on staff there. It's it's liberal in more ways than one, right? It's a liberal arts college, but it also is like their idea of Catholicism and stuff. They really concentrate on social justice and that kind of stuff. So pretty strong philosophy department, 6 philosophers in the department, and I teach metaphysics there. I teach logic there, critical thinking. I teach kind of scientific reasoning courses, a lot of that stuff. And what I publish in is basically logic, philosophy, religion, and metaphysics. Mostly philosophy, religion. I have a lot of articles on arguments for God, problem of evil, and problem of natural evil in particular. I've in a forthcoming text on philosophy, textbook on philosophy of religion, a reader. At the end of it, it's got a bunch of kind of reflective articles: why I am a Christian, why I am a Buddhist, and I got the why I am an atheist chapter. So that's coming out. That's coming out soon. And I teach. I've also do logic. Like there's the Bad Arguments book, which is like 101 logical fallacies. 10 of them are mine. 10 of the entries there are mine. I teach a lot on critical thinking and logic and logical fallacies and stuff at school. So I know a lot about kind of logic and argumentation there as well. So that's mainly what I concentrate on. The other thing I do, if you can't tell by looking behind me, is I do a lot of pop culture and philosophy. So that's a whole bunch of Star Wars action figures. Below that is some Lord of the Rings. If you go lower, there's some other stuff, so I edit books on that. I have a book called Black Mirror and Philosophy. I did the book on the movie Inception and philosophy. I have a course with the great courses called Sci-Fi, PHI, Sci-Fi, Science Fiction as Philosophy. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Palgrave Handbook of Pop Culture as Philosophy, which is a kind of ongoing project that I have that's at the end is going to be like 100 chapters. I mean, this thing is friggin' huge. And it's been a lot of work, but it covers television and movies and graphic novels and video games and comedians, and it's a very wide ranging project. So I do that, philosophy, religion, metaphysics, and logic, but I also do a lot of pop culture and philosophy, which kind of makes me a jack of all trades because, ethics and continental philosophy and all different kinds of stuff can come up in that pop culture stuff. So I'm not the expert on that, but I've edited chapters that delve into those kinds of things, and so I know a little bit about a lot of things.
I'd love to read that for sure.
Which one? The Palgrave series or the Black Mirror book?
All of it. I mean, particularly where you talk about the pop culture and different like Black Mirror is a phenomenal show.
So I'll plug this one. I got it right here while we're talking about it. Here we go. This is the book, Black Mirror and Philosophy. It's available on Amazon, wherever you want to find, your local bookstore or whatever. It should be there. If you're a Black Mirror fan, what makes this really fun is that what I did was we devoted a chapter to every episode separately. So it's not just, a bunch of chapters about the whole series. There is a chapter on every episode, and the goal of each one of those chapters is to try to identify basically what the moral message of that episode of Black Mirror is. And since they're self-contained stories, they all kind of have a different message, right? And since they're self-contained stories, you can read the chapters in any order, right? Because you can watch the show in any order and then read the chapters in any order. And then at the end, there's 6 chapters that are about the series as a whole. Boy, I'm proud of a lot in this book. There's really good chapters all over the place. The one that is most unique, maybe I should say, is I co-authored the chapter on Bandersnatch. And Bandersnatch, if you remember, is the Choose Your Own Adventure episode.
Yeah.
We wrote a Choose Your Own Adventure, philosophical adventure chapter for awesome. It, so that it's one page, and then here's 2 questions that are raised. Which one would you like to discuss? And you can go, and then that one raises 2 more questions, and you can follow that. The chapter ends 5 different ways. It's there's multiple paths you can take through it. I mapped it all out to get it all done, and
I'll definitely be getting that and reading.
Cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's also an audiobook. It's an audiobook if you like that. The Choose Your Own Adventure chapter I go through it twice in the audiobook. There's kind of 2 different versions of that chapter for that. But yeah, it's a lot of fun to edit. And I've taught a course on this at King's College a couple times. Students love it. It blows their freaking mind.
Do you narrate your audio book?
I do not. I kind of offered for them to have me do that, but they didn't. They ended up having somebody else do it.
Okay. They just get someone professional or something,
yeah.
I assume.
Yeah. It's Wiley Blackwell's the publisher, so they they're the real deal, and they got a I think they actually, for that one, I think maybe they got, if I'm remembering correctly, they got a few. So if a male wrote the chapter, they had a male read it, but if a female wrote the chapter, they had a female do it. I'm pretty sure. I'm thinking that's the right book that they did that on. So yeah. So if you like the movie Inception too, my book on that's an audiobook as well. And that one will blow your mind as well, because I basically, if you kind of reinterpret the entire film in the first 3 or 4 chapters, there's this kind of this argument that Nolan doesn't get to define what the meaning of the film is. We have to look at the content of the film itself to figure that out. And when we look at the content of the film, it's not nearly as simple as it seems. And not only is it extremely possible that he did not get back home at the end and he's actually still dreaming, it's very possible that the entire movie from beginning to ending is all a dream, and that has certain significance and that kind of stuff. And there's lots of clues, and yeah.
Just out of curiosity, I got to ask, have you watched a show called The Leftovers?
I know what The Leftovers is. I have not watched it though, right? Isn't it one about the rapture?
Yeah. Well, it's unclear what the event actually is, but that, I think you should watch it, because that would be a really good one to write a book about. That is a phenomenal show.
Cool.
I'd be interested in seeing your thoughts about that at some point.
Yeah. I may end up having to write an article on it. I also have a blog for Psychology Today. I actually have 2 of them. One's on arguments called The Logical Take. The other one's on pop culture. And so I kind of write on whatever I want there. If to do a book on it, Wiley Blackwell has to say, this would actually sell enough copies to, and
sure.
Probably one on the leftovers would not work because it's too old. It's not as popular. I couldn't even get them as much of a success as my Inception book was. It's sitting right there. If I can point to it there. I could not get them to do a book on Tenet. I wanted to do a book on Tenet so bad. And the movie wasn't popular enough. And so they're like, the numbers don't come out. So I settled for writing a couple articles on Psychology Today. And there's a really good chapter on Tenet in the Pelgrave series. And the Pelgrave series is eventually going to be printed. But before it is, the chapters that are done are already available online. So if you Google the Pelgrave Pop Culture as Philosophy Handbook, you will find them. They're available through your local library. There's a bunch of different ways of getting them. And if you want to have your head freaking blown, if you watch Tenet and don't quite understand it and not sure what's going on, the article on that is really, really good and explains what's going on, explains what the Seder Square is, if you know how that relates to the movie, and then explains what its moral message about free will and that kind of stuff is in a really, really good, clear way.
If nothing else, it'll be worth watching that show. I think you'd really like it if you like that kind of stuff. Yeah,
Leftovers. Yeah, I'll add that to the list. In fact, I think it's on my Netflix list. I just haven't got to it. Right now I'm watching Dark. So I'll eventually get to it. But yeah.
So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is that you had mentioned wanting to discuss what you believe the effects and the role of religion on society, what that has been like. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that. And then you mentioned, I actually didn't know that you also taught logic. So there's something about that I want to ask you later down the line, but
sure,
I'll go back to that later.
Sure, yeah. So when you talk about the effects of religion on society, we could talk about the past effects or the current effects.
Right? Right.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think that this is not something I'm an expert on or anything like that, but I think that a decent argument could be made that religion in the past played an integral role in the development of society, right? Like that way in the past, it held knit groups together where they needed to be held together, that it formed a kind of communal bond for people and that kind of stuff. And so you could probably say that it played some kind of role in society that was pretty important, right? But now, today, that we have modern governments and modern societies and modern technology and that kind of stuff, that religion probably does more harm than good at this point, right? So it's the kind of thing like, early Wittgenstein, thought of philosophy, right? It's a ladder you use to get to the top, and then once you get there, you kick it away, right? You don't need it anymore. And that I think that religion mainly just does more harm than good now, because it weds people to bad ideas. It makes them into knit groups and shun all outsiders when we actually need more camaraderie and more acceptance of other groups, that kind of stuff. It leads to that kind of tribalism can be really bad for politics and be really bad for democracy, can be really bad for scientific information. So not to keep plugging my stuff, but in my book, The Oroville, I have a book on the sci-fi show, The Oroville, called Exploring the Oroville.
I actually went to a wedding with one of the guys that is on that show. I can't remember what character he plays though.
Oh, really?
So that's my only connection to that show.
Oh, okay, cool.
Cool guy, really cool guy.
Is he the redhead?
No, he's got blonde hair. I'll Google him and I'll get it.
Okay, all right.
The second I see his face, I'll know who it is.
He's got blonde hair. It might be the guy that plays Isaac. But anyway, so I wrote a chapter on climate change for that book. One of my chapters in that book is on climate change. And one of the things that I talk about is how religious identity fuels climate change denial. One of the books I read for that is called The Gospel of Climate Denialism. No, The Gospel of, I forget The Gospel of Denialism, I think is what it's called. But it's about how evangelicalism has become engrossed with climate change denial, and it's become a societal thing. It's not about the evidence. It's about, in order to be evangelical, you can't be concerned about the environment, because if you are, then you're a lefty liberal, and that makes you equivalent to an atheist. So you're on the side of the devil. And so evidence, everything be damned, right? You have to not be concerned about the environment. That includes thinking that climate change is a hoax. And that obviously is extremely dangerous. Quite honestly, if it weren't for evangelical denialism of climate change, we likely would have done something about it by now. It is their denialism that has driven Congress to do nothing about it, right?
I mean, it's amazing that anybody takes these people seriously still.
Yeah, right. But you have congressmen from the floor of Congress saying things like, well, the Bible says that God promised never to, flood the earth again, and so climate change can't be a problem. Or if it is, I'm sure God can take care of it. I mean, elected officials from the floor of Congress have made those kinds of arguments against voting for climate change regulation and climate change legislation, right? I mean, it is asinine and insane.
It is insane.
Right, but they're doing that for religious reasons, right? And it's like, oh no, they're using the religion. People will say they're using the religion as an excuse, because they're funded by the fossil fuel industry and blah blah blah. One, that's not clear that that's true at all. If they really do have those religious beliefs, and two, that doesn't matter, because if that's what they're doing, then the religion makes people susceptible to it. They're able to make those kinds of excuses and get away with it because of the religious identity and religious beliefs of people, right?
Sure.
And so in the paper I sent you about moral culpability and belief in God, I essentially argue that those who choose to believe in God by faith are immoral for doing so, because essentially they have made themselves guilty by association. They have joined this group that is actually damaging society and doing bad things to society. And so even if they're not doing anything bad themselves, they're propping up that group by belonging, contributing, whatever. And so they're kind of guilty by association. The only way you could possibly alleviate that guilt is if you try to work from the inside to try to change the organization. But at this point, I think it should be very clear that it ain't changing. The only way to move forward is for it to die, for the organization to go away. Right.
Yeah. Nor would it reverse the actual, in the entailment of say the example of like climate change, like you gave, right? Like that's kind of stamped onto them as a byproduct. So it's not like you just kind of remove that. Yeah.
There's basically no way, no getting out of it at this point.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you'd have to have a complete. There would have to be a movement inside it that got its own name and a complete revival and like identified itself as we are the environmentalist Christians, right? Yeah. And it would have to take root and take hold and become super popular. And maybe you could save it that way, but I just don't see that as even a possibility.
Yeah, sure.
Some of what you said reminded me of a conversation I had with somebody, which just kind of touches on the last conversation we had. This person thought that it was because of religion that any context for meaning and social growth and moral growth was even possible, and that without religion, people become lost. And it's like, no, religion is one avenue for existential thought, perhaps, but it's not the source of it. It's one expression of it. But when you have people who are so deeply religious, they can't see that. They can't imagine an existence outside of that kind of dogma.
Yeah,
they think that is the all that there is, and if you strip that away, then there's chaos. And it's like, open a philosophy book and put in the time to educate yourself on these topics, just blindly parrot nonsense that's been taught to you.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, for them, it is morality for them is defined by God's commands, and that's all they've ever known. And they behave the way that they do because they are trying to gain God's favor and avoid his damnation, right? And that's their whole motivation for why they do what they do, right? So from their perspective, like, all they can see is if you strip that away, then morality, there's no truth makers for morality anymore, and there's no reason to be moral anymore because there's no God watching you anymore. And so it would be chaos if they were stripped of that, right? Sure. But that's not how everybody defines morality, right? That's kind of what I mean by before science, before society really solidified, and certainly before philosophy, right? Maybe that really is where people got their morality. It was just religion, right? And so, without religion way back then, it might have been chaos, right? But we've come so far since then, right? We've realized that morality can't be grounded in God's commands. Thank you, Plato, and the Euthyphro dilemma and all that stuff, right? And we've had progress in philosophy and morality and that kind of stuff, and we, have a pretty good idea of, how to do moral reasoning, and it doesn't require God, and so we can do all that without God. I interrupted you.
Oh no, you're fine. I was interrupting. I actually had a question for you on that, because it seems like, right, when I've talked to people who will say, like, yeah, the good is grounded in the commands, the kind of the way that they try to avoid the Euthyphro in a sense is to say, well, the good is God's nature. And I wanted to see if you thought that this just poses this very similar dilemma, or essentially two horns to take, which is it good simply in virtue that the properties rest within God, right? Or is it just that that it's in accordance with the good? If you take the former, then you're just talking about some independent standard, which I don't think really any Christians taking. Usually they take the first one to say, Well, yeah, in virtue of the properties that rest within God, that's what God looks to, right? It's nature. But then it seems to me all you're saying is that any God with a nature that it looks to would be the moral good, but then that's consistent with an evil God, right? That could just look to its nature. And so
Exactly.
I didn't know if that criticism, if you kind of hold a similar one, or if you think that's, or what your take would be on that, I guess.
Yeah, so here's how I explain it. Here's another, I keep plugging my stuff, so which I said I wanted to do, but I'm doing a little bit too much. But in my other course, great courses, Big Questions of Philosophy, lecture 26. The big question in that lecture is, does God define the good? And I raise a youth for a problem and say the problem with divine command theory is that if God's commands are what make that which is good good, then that which is good is arbitrary, right? God could have commanded something different. God could have commanded baby murder, which he does in the Old Testament, but if he commanded it, it would be good, right? And it's like, well, we wouldn't say that. And if you say, well, God would never do that, well, the only reason you would say that is because you think that it's bad. You think there's something about it that makes it bad, that therefore God would not command it. If you think God would never do that, then you must not be a divine command theorist, because you think there's some standard that means
some independent standard. Yeah. Like,
right.
Well, and then that point, like for me as the anti-realist, like I'm saying, yeah, that's in line with what I want the realist to do, is provide some independent, normal standard that's untethered from just like desires, right? Because as a subjectivist, I'm going to be like, yeah, the truth value is true in virtue of the agent's, desires. The proposition will be true. I'm like, what I want is the untethered thing, but it seems that the Christian is only going to be in a subjective meta-ethical thesis, no matter really what they argue, unless they take that horn where they're like, well, yeah, there is this thing independent. And then it's like, okay, at that point, what do we need the God for? And so it seems like you just really can't win, even if you say God's the good and try to avoid the youth throw.
So I say that the way out of that particular objection, right, that if divine command theory makes morality arbitrary because God could command something different, could command baby murder and it would be good, the way out of that, I say, is like, well, you would say that it's not God commands per se, it's God's character. And it's because God's character is such that he doesn't like murder, that makes murder wrong. So God, it makes God the standard, right?
So the good isn't just in the command at that point. Is that what they're
right? It's in the standard. But the problem with that is it just backs up the problem essentially, right?
Yeah.
Now you just say, well, it's still the case that what's good is arbitrary, because if God's character had been different, then something, then baby murder would be moral if God's character had been different, right?
Exactly.
And they'll say, well, God's character can't be different. You say, no. Once God exists, if God's immutable, his character can't be different than it is. Yeah. Right. But it is, if really it's just God's character that defines what the good is, then God's character could have been anything.
Sure.
Right. It could have been completely different. And once it's that way, it can't be any different after that. But God's character could have been such that he approved of murder, and then murder would be good. Right. So it just backs up the question. Well, God's commands could have been different. Oh, well, God's the standard. Well, because of its character. Well, God's character could have been different. And so we're back to
doesn't it get worse than
arbitrary.
that? Like if the person goes, like, if they bite the bullet and they're like, and I'm just kind of speaking out loud, but like if they bite the bullet and they're like, okay, well, it couldn't have been any other way. And say they're like a Thomist and they take like God to be pure act, right? Like there's no potentials, at which he can actualize. It's just pure act. Doesn't that just like result in modal collapse or like necessitarianism, where like there could only be one way? And I don't think you would want that as the Christian, because then God doesn't freely create, right? It seems to entail some type of modal collapse if you bite the bullet and say, yeah, it couldn't have been any other way. That's the only way his nature could have been, right? Because the criticism I'm saying is that you're just saying a God with a nature, right, deems the good. And I'm saying any God with any nature, that's entirely arbitrary. And if they're like, well, no, the nature could only be X, it couldn't be Y, it couldn't be Z, it couldn't be all these things, then I'm saying then there's no potentiality, and it seems that there's no possible world, right? So then all you can say is that this is necessitarianism, and everything that stems from it is a necessary truth, not contingent. But I don't know if you would take that same leap or not.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a legitimate criticism, right? If they say that necessarily God's character, whatever, could not have been any other way, well, then everything he does is of necessity, right? There is no free choice in God at all. Mm-hmm. And therefore he cannot get any moral credit for anything that he does, because there is no free choice at all. And then that means that if he's not, doesn't have to get moral credit, then he's not all good. Yeah. It's really hard to understand. I mean, at that point, you're just talking about a form. God's just a form. He can't be the personal God.
Divine
You can't be the
simplicity might say, hey, well, we're only speaking analogically about these things. And then in that case, I'm like, I don't even know what that means.
Yeah,
like,
right. And then
then
you're not talking about the Christian God anymore, right? Like when you kind of take that out,
Yeah. Also, at that point, they've already lost the argument, because at the point you're talking about nature. It's like, well, like as a more realist, I'm also talking about nature. I'm just making one less assumption, which is that nature has come from God as opposed to just coming from nature. I
personally think that's not it's not the God that any Christians are talking about,
exactly.
Right? This kind of, this is basically, it's just a Platonic form that we're talking about at that point, right? It is not the personal God that performs miracles and sent his son to die on the cross and Like, we're talking about the hardcore academic theologian's God, right? Almost, it's basically a deism God almost at that point, right? And so we're not talking about what most people are talking about God about at that point anyway, so.
Which actually brings me to another point real fast, is to say that kind of bothers me in these kind of conversations, is that when I'm like looking at metaphysical considerations or someone's trying to lay it out for me, I don't get the demons, the angels, and all that stuff at the front, right? Like that's all stuff you have to learn about. You actually don't ever really get there, right? But it's weird because it's packaged in your ontology, and so like for you to have this like I don't know the right word, but this obscure kind of version of theism, it seems to me that it's like, okay, well, yeah, I don't really, it seems like you're doing all the work for me in a sense.
Yeah.
In some ways. So.
Yeah. See, you had a question about logic when I was talking about moral culpability. Did you want to come back to that?
Yeah. So this is a little bit a separate issue, but I've been arguing nonstop with people this week who make the claim that we somehow presuppose logic and presuppose rationality. When we're applying reason, that we somehow have to presuppose that and to claim otherwise, it's to be circular. And to me, that doesn't make any sense. Like that it's like saying, if I want to see whether or not a pen works, I try to write with a pen and see if it works. Where's the presupposition in any of that space? They're convinced that somehow just the process of reasoning is itself presupposed, as opposed to being just a self-evident experience that we go through, whether it's innate or whether it's learned or whether it's a combination of both.
Right.
I just wondering what your perspective on that kind of claim is.
Yeah. So I have written a bit about this in my chapter on faith in the Inception book. It's a little bit in that chapter I sent you about God and moral accountability, right? Believing Jesus and believing God and moral accountability. So the argument is this, and to a certain degree they're right, but that doesn't prove what they think it proves. Okay. So what Aristotle pointed out was that the basic axioms of logic, the laws of thought, what he called the laws of thought, right? The rule of identity, everything's identical to itself. Non-contradictions, nothing can both be true and false at the same time, and then excluded middle, everything is either true or false. That these are the groundings of all logical inferences, right? And as a result, because of that, you can't argue for them without arguing in a circle. Any argument that you would present for any of these axioms would itself assume those axioms, and so you'd be arguing in a circle. So essentially, you have to start by assuming those kinds of things, and then you argue from there. Right. A similar point could be made about like modus tollens. If P then Q, P therefore Q. Right. You can't argue for that because basically any argument that you tried to present, you tried to give for that would itself assume that modus tollens is valid. Right. So you can't argue for its validity without assuming its validity. Or a similar kind of point could be made about induction itself. Right. This was Hume's problem of induction. Right. That, induction relies on this assumption that the future will resemble the past. So in order, all inductive arguments, kind of rely on that assumption. So can you prove that the future will resemble the past? And the best that you can do is point to past instances in which the future resembled the past and then say, so it always will. But of course, that relies on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. And so all we can kind of do is assume that, right? So in a certain kind of way, it is true that there are certain axioms of logic or induction, whether inductive or deductive logic, that we have to assume, because to argue for them, you'd have to assume them, and you'd be begging the question, you'd be arguing in a circle. However, two things can be said about that. One is that this is perfectly acceptable. Okay, let me say two things. I'll say them in a different order. First of all, the fact that you have to do that does not mean that you can now believe whatever the hell you want without argument, right? Like, so the fact that we have to make these kinds of things by assumption, because to do otherwise, to try to argue for them, you go in a circle, does not mean, and therefore, if I just want to assume that God exists, I can. And if I want to assume that angels exist, I can. You assume that if P then Q, P therefore Q is valid, therefore I can believe in angels. Like, that does not follow, right? The mere fact that you can believe in one thing, that it's okay to believe one kind of axiom, does not mean that it's okay to believe in another. You'd have to show that there's some kind of similarity, and there's no kind of similarity between them. All right.
So how would you? I guess real quick, like, how do you differentiate between saying it's okay to make one kind of assumption as opposed to another kind of assumption? I do want to, after you finish, I do want to reply to this, because actually I think I disagree to a degree.
Okay, so that's the second point that I have here, is that the reason that it's okay to do one and not the other is because it is unavoidable to assume that modus tollens is valid. I cannot live without assuming that modus tollens is valid. If you tried to navigate the world by, not assuming that if P is true, then Q is true, but if P is true, well, then Q doesn't follow. You could not operate in the world, right? Let's take Aristotle's non-contradiction, right? Something can't both be true and false at the same time. If somebody actually rejected that, you couldn't hold a conversation with them, right? The example I give in one of my courses, right, is you ask him, so did you have fun at the party? Fun at Steve's party? I wasn't there. Oh, where were you? I was at Steve's party. You just said you weren't. Yes, I did. No, you didn't. No, I didn't. Like, it is... You could not hold a conversation with such a person, right? These kind of things are necessary for communication. They are necessary for navigating the world. To reject induction is the very definition of insanity, right? The colloquial definition of insanity, right, is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, right? Well, induction demands that we would expect the same result every time. If you don't do that, you're insane. Right, and so it is perfectly acceptable to assume these things, right? Despite the fact that you can't argue with them, without begging the question, right? Because they are essential. You cannot do without them. You cannot help but assume them, right? This is not true of belief in God and angels and all the other stuff that people want to say, well, I can just assume without argument, right? And so that's the major difference there. So that's my. Go ahead.
So my feelings on that are the following, because I both agree and disagree. Like, I don't think that, because of what you just said, like, these notions are, I believe, are secondary to our experience. We can't, there's a reason why we can't help but think in that way, because that is how we are structured to experience the world. Mm-hmm. So a presupposition is holding a position before doing the work. I don't think I'm assuming these things. It may be the case that ontologically, reality may always be, at a hand's reach away from me. Like, I can never actually experience things as they are, like Kant, right, and whatnot. But so when I accept the law of non-contradiction, I don't consider that an assumption or a presupposition. I consider that something that is self-evident arising from my experience, that then I can formalize and I can kind of formulate in, okay, this is the law that describes this thing. Mm-hmm. But really what I'm talking about is the way that I experience the world, which I can, regardless of the ontology of the nature that I'm experiencing, the experience is the experience, right?
Right.
So I just don't buy that these are presuppositions.
Okay, so the response, I think, is that like your experience tells you that non-contradiction is true, in the following way: you've gone around your entire life and you've never seen a contradiction be true, right? Like that's the experience that you've had, is you've never seen a true contradiction, right? But of course, the law is that contradictions can never be true, right? And so you've just, all the ones that you've seen so far haven't been true, but you haven't run across a true one yet. Well, it's entirely possible that there's another one out there, right? Unless you accept it as an axiom that all contradictions are false, right?
I can be open. I'm okay with the idea that we can't be certain of anything except maybe my own existence, right? Like I don't need to make any kind of claims ontologically about any of these things. I can only say that because of what I understand about the nature of my mind, I don't see how it could even make sense to think about these things differently. Mm-hmm. Then that may be just a statement about my mind as opposed to nature itself, right?
Well, I'm worried. I'm wondering if maybe the criticism would be like where Dave. So I'm trying to think. So like if you would say, through your experience, and David's laying out that, so it would seem like if you did make the declaration that non-contradiction is always true in that sense, that would undermine aspects you have about like induction as well, because you're going off of your experience. And so
I was kind of trying to go in that direction.
So I'm wondering if that's kind of what you're laying down, David.
I was kind of going that way. So like one is that that you can't know that all of them, all contradictions are true. You can say all the ones I've seen so far are true. Now you could induce from that they're all false. All contradictions are false, right? Yeah. But in doing so, you're using some induction there, and now we're back to Hume's problem, right? Which we're going to have to assume the future resembles the past and that kind of stuff, right? So again, they're very safe assumptions to make, but like even the very kind of notion that, well, I can use my experience in the world to infer these truths or whatever, that's going to be an assumption that we make at the beginning. But again, I think that it's perfectly acceptable to make that assumption. It could, because it is inescapable, and to not do it is insanity. And the fact that we have to do that in that way does not mean that it does not justify the argument, well, you take the principles of logic on faith, so I can take God's existence on faith, and we're both on equal footing. We're both doing the same thing. No, we're not. Yeah. It is completely different.
I'm also wondering what the proponent of like paraconsistent logic or dialetheism, they might just agree with Cease's or whoever's hold the position. And that's always been the struggle for me, is that like you couldn't just say in virtue of my experience that's indicative of the way things are, because what motivational force is that for the person that accepts true contradictions?
Right. Or not true to contradiction. That's one of the things about paraconsistent logic, like trivalent logic and bivalent, or trivalent logic and fuzzy logic, multi-valued logic, is that they want to have more than just true false for the truth values of propositions. And yet they always want to preserve non-contradiction, and they want to preserve excluded middle.
Sure.
Right. Like one of the problems with like trivalent logic is that, disjunctions are true, A or B, right? If one of the conjuncts is true, right? Well, and what's supposed to be the case is A or not A is a tautology. It's always true. Yeah. Right. But if you have more than one truth value, you could have, well, A is not true, but not A is not true either. And so you'd have this disjunction of A or not A, but neither one of them is true. And so the disjunction isn't true, A or not A, and yet A or not A has to be true. That's excluded middle, right? And so that's one of the difficulties with things like trivalent logic, is that they're trying to do that, but they're trying to preserve those laws of thought. But we could go on. I talk a little bit about that in the sixth chapter of my dissertation. But
that's interesting, because I'm wondering if like some part of that they're trying to preserve might go towards Cease's point of that this is actually rooted in experience and there is no presupposition, though I don't know if that would be cashed out. I'm
kind of thinking they're a priori, but go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that if we're going with a fallibilistic approach to knowledge, then I don't ever need to talk about certainty. Mm-hmm. I can say, my reasoning is what it is. I can't be certain that ontologically this is always how it is, or that I'm not under some kind of illusion.
Sure.
But all I can talk about is that which is within my field of vision, right, as Wittgenstein talks about. And all I have is the tools that I have. And that's, but I don't think that is equatable from my perspective to a presupposition. Because again, I think it is secondary from my understanding with how our reasoning develops and our experience of the world.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm very friendly to that. I do not think the certainty is required for knowledge either. That's something I teach in my classes constantly when we talk about induction and inference are the best explanation. And there's all kinds of things that we can know, even though we can't be certain of them. So I'm perfectly fine with that. And I'm not calling for certainty here. So the idea, the problem here is not that we can't be certain of these assumptions, and so we just have to assume them. The problem is that we can't have any evidence for them at all without begging the question, right? So, like, I mean, it's almost like you can't have evidence for evidence without assuming that evidence is something that you should have. That evidence is reliable,
Sure.
right? And so just like the assumption that evidence is a good thing and that it should, stand behind knowledge is not something you can argue for. You can't gather evidence for that. Like you can't present an argument for the reliability of arguments without, going in a circle.
So you wouldn't. So you would say that you'd be against the idea that the reason why we value evidence comes out of our experience of the world.
Like ultimately, like, so on a kind of surface level, it is, right? I've seen evidence work so many times that I have, that gives me kind of good reason to want evidence for something, right? But ultimately, that evidence is evidence for evidence. So at the base, there's some kind of assumption here that just like evidence is a good thing that I can't have evidence for. I just have to assume on a base level.
So you think there has to be something behind just a pure like phenomenological experience?
I think so.
Can I put it in terms of like categorical, like epistemic? I don't know if you'd say like categorical epistemic norms or something, or epistemic categorical norms. Wouldn't it just be the case that like what you're undermining, David, is that you're saying like there's nothing like categorical that we ought to like value the evidence unless, or whatever you're starting with, without you just having to beg that question, right? But you don't get that for granted to say like, well, we should just value evidence. That's like some epistemic categorical norm that we should value or something, right? That you're saying to even get off the ground there, like it's just assumptions. They're all going to be hypothetical in virtue of like, I guess, the goal or something.
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding you correctly, I think that's right. But again, it's just this. It's ultimately what you have to realize is the fact that we do that with things that are so fundamental, like you need evidence for beliefs, or if P then Q, P therefore Q, and contradictions can't be like, it's so basic that does not follow that anybody can like, it can't be used in an argument for so I can believe in God.
Well, yeah, wouldn't the question kind of be why ought I care about evidence, and then that axiom is just going to have to go, well, we have to start here. I kind of have to start here and somewhat beg the question on that axiom, because nothing's going to show you why you should take it.
Yeah, and if
you just buy into the axiom,
and if you reject that axiom, I can't talk to you anymore because I can't hold a conversation with you, right? If you reject the idea that we need evidence for beliefs, then I'm just not going to have a conversation with you. So why bother? Because evidence doesn't matter to you, right? If you don't believe that arguments are reliable, like reasoning and arguments are reliable, then I'm not going to talk to you, because obviously reasoning and arguing, right? And any argument in like, that's the other, like maybe this is the third thing, right? To point to it is that the other thing about is if you argue against these axioms, you refute yourself, right? You can't give me an argument for rejecting arguments. You can't give me evidence for rejecting evidence, right? Like you can't, like you end up refuting yourself by doing that, right? And so that's another reason, like to even argue against these things. To argue for them is circular, but to argue against them is self-refuting. And so
so that's like if someone's like, well, how do you know you actually exist in some way? And if someone tries to write a syllogism to prove, well, here's why you don't exist, the second you're putting pen to paper, you're like disproving your point, because you're just like, oh crap, in order for me to do this, I must exist.
Right.
At some point, I would definitely love to bring you back to talk about more about the specific point, because I think I have some kind of weird intuitions about this, which I am still trying to find a way to verbalize more coherently.
Well, I used to agree with your position, Cease, and I've come off of it a little bit, in the sense that, like, at least my issue is that I don't know what it means. Why ought, you establish some norm, like if you're going to go back to that axiom, it's going to kind of go back to like, if it's A equals A, it assumes it's truth, right? But we're not going to like add something justificatory beyond that. We're just going to have to move on from that point, it seems like, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're laying down.
I think part of it is like how we view value. Like do we think that values are arbitrary, or is there a foundation that leads to the values being what they are necessarily?
This might be a good topic, because especially for him with logic, I'm someone that's going to take like, there's no way you go from like descriptive to the normative without just assuming some value there that's not subsumed. And so maybe David agrees or disagrees, and I know that's where me and Cease disagree a lot on a part.
But to close this out, I'll just say the right way, I think, to respond to somebody who's challenging you on this, right, on theistic grounds, like saying I can believe in God because you believe in the axioms of logic, is to no, this is different. So let's just begin by seeing what we agree with. Do you agree that if P then Q, P therefore Q, right? Do you agree that contradictions can't be true? Do you agree? And if they don't, at any point you say, well, then I can't talk to you anymore, right? And if they do, they say, okay, now we're agreed on that. And so we can start with those assumptions. Now let's move on to other stuff. I don't agree with you that you can just assume that God exists.
Yeah, you don't get to just you don't additional subsequent assumptions.
Right.
Oh, because I did this. Because then what stops your interlocutor to go, well, naturalism is true because naturalism is true. It's like I'll make the same move you'll make, if that's what we're gonna do. But,
okay.
So let's talk. You want to talk about Kalam and fine tuning?
Yeah. I wanted to know what your perspective on those issues were.
I'm gonna adjust my camera.
Yeah, so we were talking about this because you asked me what good arguments are there for theism out there, and I wouldn't call either one of these good arguments, but I do think they're the most persuasive in a lot of people's minds. So the Kalam argument is essentially the argument that it's a cosmological argument. It's kind of a first cause kind of an argument. It's generated out of shortcomings of other arguments that suggest that God must exist because there must be a first cause, right? That every cause has an effect, and every effect has a cause, and you trace it back. There must be a first cause, something like that. And it was developed by people in the Kalam, the Islamic Kalam school, because they realized that even if there has to be a first cause, there's no reason that first cause couldn't be the universe rather than God, right? So even if the argument works and establishes a first cause, why couldn't it be the universe? And so the Kalam argument tries to give us a reason for why it couldn't be the universe. And essentially the argument is that things that begin to exist need a cause, things that don't begin to exist don't need a cause. The universe began to exist, God did not. So God could be the first cause, but the universe couldn't be the first cause. It couldn't be the causeless causer, as it were, because things that begin to exist need a cause, things that don't. And God's one of the things that don't, if he exists, right? So that's the argument. The problem with the argument, and this is a bit complicated, and again, I have a paper on this if you want to see this. But the problem with that argument is that it essentially equivocates. So the issue here is that first premise that says everything that begins to exist needs a cause, right? Well, when they give that premise, the kinds of things that they mention as the way they provide evidence for that is they say, look, here's the marker. It began to exist. It has a cause for its explanation. Here's the glasses case, right? It has an explanation for its existence. Here's the bottle. Here's the chair. Here's here's the book, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of these things began to exist, and they have an explanation for their existence. Therefore, all things that begin to exist have a cause, right? Well, the problem that we realize here is that how the marker came into existence is different than how the universe came into existence, because the marker came into existence when matter that already existed came to be arranged in a certain kind of way, right? The matter that makes up this marker has existed since the beginning of the universe. It just came to be arranged in that way, and that's when the marker came into existence. And if I were to take it apart atom by atom, the marker would no longer exist anymore, right? So when you say that the marker has an explanation for its existence, it began to exist and has an explanation for its existence, what you're saying is matter arrangement has an explanation, right? When matter comes to be formed in such a way that it forms what we call a new object, there is an explanation for how the matter became arranged in that way, right? That first premise is ultimately about matter arrangement, right? But then in the third premise, when it says, oh, the universe began to exist, the universe beginning to exist, that's not in terms of matter becoming arranged, matter that already existed came to be arranged in a certain kind of way, and it formed a new object that we call the universe.
So when
the universe came into existence, it was the matter of the universe itself coming into existence. So the first premise is about matter arrangement. The third premise is about matter coming into existence. So the argument equivocates. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Two things I guess I wanted to ask. Would you use material and efficient, like if there was to be a more humble first premise, like anything with a material, or would you use terms like efficient or a material to be more concise? Because then you lead to the universe has a material cause, or if it doesn't seem like the theist wants to go there.
Yeah. So this is the kind of second thing to say about it, right? So given that the argument equivocates, there's a way to fix this, right? So let me give you a fun example, and then I'll kind of come back to it, right? My favorite argument that equivocates as an example of the fallacy of equivocation is bologna's better than nothing. Nothing's better than prime rib. Therefore, bologna's better than prime rib. Bologna's better than nothing. Nothing's better than prime rib. So bologna's better than prime rib.
Yeah.
Get it?
I see what you did. Yeah.
Right? The problem is that the word nothing is being equivocated on.
Sure.
Right? But once you clarify the argument, having bologna to eat is better than having nothing to eat at all. There is no particular food that's better than prime rib. Therefore, bologna's better than prime rib. Now that doesn't follow. Once you unequivocate, it becomes clear, right?
Sure.
Now you can fix the argument, right? So once you realize that it equivocates, you can fix the argument so it doesn't equivocate anymore, right? So on the Kalam argument, if the first and third premise are about two different things, well, let's make them about the same thing, and that way the argument doesn't equivocate anymore, right?
Yeah.
So then you would say first premise. Whenever matter comes into existence, there's an explanation for the matter coming into existence, right? Third premise, the universe, the matter of the universe came into existence, therefore the matter of the universe needs a cause, right? Now the argument doesn't equivocate anymore, but now we have a second problem. It begs the question. Because that first premise, whenever matter comes into existence, it needs an explanation. Well, setting some quantum stuff aside, which I can talk about in a second, the only time matters come into existence is when the universe came into existence. And so that first premise is just saying when the universe came into existence, it must have had a cause. The third premise is when the universe came into existence, it must have had a cause. Now you're just arguing in a circle. Your first premise is your third, is your conclusion essentially. And so you're right back to arguing in a circle, right?
So applying a principle of charity can be damaging almost to the argument where you're just let me do the best I can with it. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So either you equivocate or you fix equivocation and now you argue in a circle, right? And then the further problem is that first premise is just false. Every time matter comes into existence, it has an explanation. That's not actually true. There are quantum fluctuations on the quantum realm where matter comes into existence spontaneously without a cause. And Ed Tryon has actually argued persuasively that the features of our universe are consistent with it being just a big version of a quantum fluctuation, a quantum vacuum fluctuation. And so that kind of derails the argument as well. But even if we didn't have that, there's a circular problem.
But even if we were to agree that there has to be an explanation, it doesn't lead to therefore that explanation has to be God, regardless.
Well, they're saying
explanation or cause.
It's supposed to be, they do it in terms of explanation rather than cause. So you don't have this problem of causes have to precede their effects. And so nothing can precede the universe because the Big Bang is the first moment. And so you can't have a cause before the Big Bang. They do it in terms of explanation. So you don't.
But if everything has an explanation, and this is kind of the CJ's question that he has to ask, sorry to derail, but I have a similar position as CJ's, that if everything has an explanation, then every contingent fact C just becomes a necessary fact in virtue of a sufficient explanation. If everything's explained, seems to just to go into modal collapse. I don't know.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that be a separate problem, or would you not rest your head on that as much as the other ones?
Yeah, I don't think I'd rest my head on that as much. I think it's a separate problem. I mean, I saw somebody ask about the principle of sufficient reason, that everything has to have an explanation. I am, let's see, the contingency argument leads to modal collapse or brute contingency, right? I'm not sure about modal collapse versus brute contingency. I will say this: I'm skeptical of the principle of sufficient reasons for a couple of reasons. One is quantum mechanics, that things happen on the quantum realm without a reason. And we know that it's not that we can't find the reason. We know that there is no reason, right? And so the principle of quantum mechanics, there's some scientific evidence, right, that the principle of sufficient reason is false. One of my favorite problems with the principle of sufficient reason is, what's the reason it's true? If everything has an explanation, right? Why is that the case, right? What is the explanation for?
Yeah.
And it's kind of self-refuting in that kind of way, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I am perfectly fine with, I think that there are some brute facts out there, and that certainly appealing to brute facts is a much more adequate explanation in terms of scientific adequacy or philosophical adequacy, in terms of simplicity, parsimony, scope and conservatism and that kind of stuff. Appealing to brute facts is definitely preferable than appealing to an infinite God with infinite powers. That if you have why is that the case? It just is that way is a much better explanation than there's an infinite God and God made it that way, right? That's an extra giant assumption. You have to make the theory work. Brute facts are simpler.
Real quick,
sure.
And then I want to read two questions that were posted in the comment section. What are your thoughts about the theistic rejection of the notion of infinity? why they think that the notion of the
Great
universe
question.
being infinite is impossible or a paradox.
I'm
Yeah,
glad you
so-
asked that. It's a great question, by the way.
Yeah, so I mean, there's the part of the Kalam argument that I didn't mention that's kind of ingenious was that they argued long before, Big Bang cosmology and all that kind of stuff, that the universe must have a beginning. So at the time, people thought that the universe might be infinite, right? And they said that it can't be; it must have a first cause. There must be a beginning to the universe, because if there was an infinite time before now, we would have traversed, like an infinite number of moments would have occurred before now, and it's impossible to traverse an infinity, right? And the reason to think it's impossible to traverse the infinity is kind of intuitive things like you could never count to infinity, right? You could count and keep counting, but you would never get to the last number because there is no last number. And so their kind of argument was the universe must have had a beginning because otherwise you would have traversed an infinity, right? I think that's interesting. It's a very kind of ingenious argument for the time, especially early on, as the Kalam scholars were. They kind of, figured out the Big Bang, that there was a, beginning moment before, science did. So that's pretty interesting, right? But the idea ultimately that there can't be anything with infinite properties doesn't seem quite right to me. For one, unless I'm grandiosely misunderstanding things, I'm pretty sure that black holes had infinite density. And so that's a real object in the real world that actually has an infinite property, which would be infinite density. And then secondly, I think if the theist argues for that, they're getting themselves in trouble because God's supposed to have infinite goodness and infinite power and infinite.
What about the whole thing about Jesus? This is my always argument: is if Jesus gives you everlasting life, it's either the case that I burn from a finite standpoint or infinitely. Like which one is it, right? It's because if I'm just going to burn for a finite moment and you're saying to prop up your argument that actual infinities don't exist, then I'm just like, okay, well, I guess there's a point at which I won't burn anymore as an atheist. And then if they're like, well, no, you will, then you just kind of get this dance of, well, you're kind of putting your like theological foot in your mouth in order to have some metaphysical grounding, which is weird to me. But
I also want to add on to that from my understanding, and again, quantum physics is nowhere near my field, and I have a very limited grasp on it. But in talking to my brother, who is a physicist, the kind of perspective that the Kalam argues for collapses once you actually educate yourself on what modern physics is telling us. It's, from my understanding, there's not even a consensus that the universe has to have a beginning. Like the point of the Big Bang is the point where our current known laws break down.
Right.
But it doesn't tell us that the universe began to exist.
Yeah, right. Especially if the idea that like Ed Tryon argues for is that our universe could be a vacuum fluctuation, a very large vacuum fluctuation, right? But matter coming to existence spontaneously, like we know it does in small scales. This would just be a big version of that, right? But all that means is our kind of current set of matter had a beginning to its existence, right? But the idea here is that as things expand all the way down, we'll be all the way back down to a vacuum, and then just given enough time, it could happen again. And so the idea here is that although our universe would have a beginning, all of existence wouldn't. The quantum foam is and has always been there and always will be, right? And the quantum foam is not matter. The quantum foam is just like a background probability field. Right. And so it really could be infinite in all directions without contradiction. So even though our universe has a beginning, reality doesn't. And so you're right back to the whole point of the Kalam argument was, well, the universe doesn't have a beginning, but the only thing that couldn't have it, the only thing that could be the ultimate cause is God, because God doesn't have a beginning. Well, guess what? The quantum foam doesn't have a beginning, so we could be the cause. Yeah, right. And so we're, right back to,
I just want to post this. Do you think the education system in the US has failed regarding religion and free thinking, and how would you fix it?
Yes. Boy, do I have an answer to this. Where's my copy of the book? If I were in charge, do I have a copy of it here with me? I have one at the school. I don't think I have one here. Dang it, I don't. So I'll tell you how I would fix it is I would make Ted Schick and Louis Vaughn's book, How to Think About Weird Things, mandatory for all seniors in high school. That's what I would do. There would be a critical thinking course that took an entire year where they would go through that book chapter by chapter, piece by piece, and you would teach, college or high school teachers how to teach it or whatever. There would essentially be critical thinking that was required of every college student. And I think the best book on that is How to Think About Weird Things by Schick and Vaughn. I teach it all the time in my classes. And that that would that kind of critical thinking it wouldn't necessarily completely derail religion, but it would go a long way in letting people realize the fallacies in religion and making them free thinkers and being able to come to kind of conclusions on these kind of things themselves.
I couldn't agree more. And I like you, I think that these things should be thought. We should start teaching kids at a very young age how to start to properly think about things.
Yeah, and honestly, that's just my first solution. Like, get it to high school seniors, and then once that's established, you keep going younger, and you keep going younger, and you expose them to critical thinking at a younger and younger and younger age, right? And I say what I'm about to say. My wife is a high school math teacher, and my sister is a high school math teacher. But I think that we have fooled ourselves for a long time in thinking that teaching kids math and like word problems and that kind of stuff develops critical thinking. It does to like a degree in a very limited sense, but not in the way that it needs to. Not in what we really mean in philosophy by critical thinking. Math does not teach that.
And also most of the way in which high schoolers are taught now is to just worry about memorizing a bunch of facts, and then they forget as soon as they finish their test. They're concerned just with results rather than, am I actually gaining something from learning these things that is actually going to be of value for me as a human being? Not just let me memorize a bunch of facts. And
this is why I would like Schick's book to be taught to everyone, because what it does is teaches a method of reasoning he calls the search method that relies on the criteria of adequacy, testability, fruitfulness, simplicity, scope, conservatism. And it teaches you how to reason about all manner of weird things or anything else using these criteria and this whole method of reasoning. And then like chapter 6 is just them applying it to a whole bunch of weird things. And then what I do in my course is now you have to go and write a paper about your own weird thing using the search method, right? And if every student had to do that and watched other students doing it on different topics or whatever, I mean, you would see conspiracy theory thinking go down. You would see people would be more informed voters. It would be a different world, a completely different world. So yeah.
Well,
like make me Secretary of Education. I'll do that.
You also had mentioned, before we start to close here, you wanted to mention fine-tuning?
Yeah, right. So I could go on and on about fine-tuning. The fine-tuning argument essentially is that there are basic laws of the universe that are balanced on a razor's edge, so that if they were just a little bit different, life couldn't evolve anymore, right? And then so the argument is, well, somebody must have balanced it, right? Somebody must have turned the dial or whatever, balanced it on that razor's edge so that life could evolve, because if you just barely tip it one way or the other, then life couldn't evolve anymore, right? In my, so I'll plug one more thing. I have another course with the Great Courses called Exploring Metaphysics. It's an audio book you get on Great Courses. I talk about this in detail there. I have a whole lecture on the fine-tuning argument there if you're interested in this. But I'll mention two of my favorite kind of problems. One is that it's fallacious, another one that it's misleading. The argument is fallacious because it goes like this. It says, let's just take, it's actually a lot more than this. It's like, let's take these 4 constants, right, that we find in the universe. Look, if you change this one, life can't evolve anymore, right? So I'll change it back. Therefore, somebody must have said it right there. And if you change that one just a little bit, life couldn't evolve anymore. And so you change it back, right? And you change each one individually. Therefore, there must be one and only way all the dials could have been set for life to evolve. No, that does not follow. That is the same argument as this. I find a square. Let's do a square. All right. I find a square out in the real world, right? And I observe, hey, if I change the length of one of the sides, it's not a square anymore.
Yep.
Or if I change the length of that side, it's not a square anymore. Therefore, there must be one and only one way to make a square.
Exactly. Yep.
That does not follow.
Yeah,
right?
because you could have a square with a 2 centimeter sides. Just the fact that it was 4 previously and one changed to 2 does not mean that we can change. We wouldn't be able to change all the sides to 2 centimeters. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And so the same thing happens here with the dials, right? Yeah, if you change this one, life won't evolve anymore. But if this other one was also changed, it balances out and life could evolve.
Sure.
Right? And so it actually turns out that there's a number of different ways that you could set the dials and life would still evolve. Victor Stenger has a book called The Design Delusion, where he talks about experiments that him and others have done where they do little simulations and they randomly, vary the variables, right, of all the constants, and like 50% of the time you get a universe that's conducive to life. So it is not at all fine-tuned. The other, I think, Mom and dad made a square. Then yeah, if you're talking about my mom and dad, they sure did.
I think that's so funny. I don't know why I'm such a dad.
So my other favorite, and I'm borrowing from is it Monson? No. Manson. I'm borrowing from a philosopher whose last name is Manson. I'm forgetting his first name right off the top of my head, but he has a nice article called The Anti-Fine-Tuning Argument. One of the points that he makes is that how the argument is usually made is like this. They'll say things like the mass of the neutrino is 5 times 10 to the negative 34th kilograms. If it was negative 30 to the 30, so it's negative to the 30, right, to the 35th, if it's the 34th kilogram, right? So if it was to the negative 35th, neutrinos would be far too small and the mass of the universe would be so much smaller that the universe would just fly apart and galaxies couldn't form. And if it was to the 43rd, the neutrinos would be too heavy and the universe would collapse back in on itself. So aren't we lucky that there's exactly 34 zeros, in the number that describes the weight of the, the mass of the neutrino, right? The problem here is that you are measuring the mass of a neutrino, which, by the way, there's so many, like neutrinos are so small.
Yeah.
They pass through your fingernail, right? Like they pass through all existing matter. There are millions of them passing through your fingernail right now. That's how small they are. And you are measuring their weight in kilograms.
Yep. I use this exact same so you're like everything you're saying right now. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm just like, oh yes, okay.
Yes, right. So that's why it seems so remarkable, right? If you weigh it in kilograms, then adding a 0 or taking away a 0, right, is going to make this massive change, right? But that's because we're weighing it in kilograms, right? And by the way, like by adding the 0 or taking the 0 away, you're affecting the mass of the neutrino by an order of a magnitude of 10.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I mean, it's like saying that the mass of the neutrino is 100. Well, if it were 10, they'd be too light, and if it was 1,000, they'd be too heavy. There's a lot of room in between there.
Yeah,
right. You're the argument that Manson gives, the analogy that Manson gives, it'd be like saying that so Michael Jordan is 6'6".
Yeah, I was about to say, is it the Michael Jordan? Yeah, I use this.
Yeah, okay, so you've heard this, right? Yeah,
I use this on the Truth Wanted, like, and Talk Heathen probably 17, 18 different times because I think it does. It really draws a good picture. But yes, go ahead. I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, it's just that when expressed in light years, Michael Jordan's height is like 1 times 15. It's like 1 times 10 to the negative 15th or something light years, right?
Yep.
So if it was to the negative 14th, he would be like 52 feet tall, and if it's the other way, he'd be 18 inches tall.
Yeah, like 5 inches. Yeah,
right. Like, and it's like, oh, so he's exactly the one, the one height he must be in order to play basketball. No, he's not. Right. Like, there's a lot of variation there, and he could be a lot of different heights and still be a really good basketball player. Right. Yeah. They're using misleading units of measure in order to make the fine tuning seem more remarkable, and it is.
Because when you make a 5% fluctuation on like the mass of a neutrino using like whatever it is, to the negative 36, right? 10 times 4 to the negative, whatever it is, or if it's the 37, the idea is like, oh, look at this fluctuation. Even if it's 1%, like that will make this big drastic difference. But it's like, yeah, if we actually measure Michael Jordan in inches rather as opposed to light years, right? Then that 5%, maybe even 10% fluctuation, it's like not only not an issue for him to play in the NBA, but right, like you said, he'd still probably be one of the best. And it's like, that argument to me really, it really, I think it's one of the better ones. But there's a third one that I've been attracted to recently, and that has to do with the desires that God has when he finally tunes. I know you got to get going, so I just want to make this quick point and then let you get going. But would you agree that like if the the God in question is fine tuning, and we're using that as the kind of explanation that has like a closed end to it? My criticism is that it seems to have an open end, because what we can say is, why does the constants have the values that they have? And then we go, well, God has, set that he had desires and intentions this way. And it's like, okay, well, now the question is, why are the desires tuned? Why are those desires tuned for those constants in the first place? It seems that you just back the question up into this infinite regression of why are the desires itself finally tuned for those constants, and why not? If you posit God as the explanation, it doesn't solve an explanation to merely posit something else that now we have a further question on, which is why are the desires finely tuned for those constants?
Yeah,
why not
or,
for black
I mean,
holes or something like that? Right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think that is this. I forget who makes this argument, but the problem is that any explanation for the fine tuning of the universe, that any explanation for that will itself be fine tuned. You'll need an explanation for how that thing did the fine tuning,
Exactly.
right? And you back up and you see in an infinite regress, right? So it's simpler to just say, I mean, even if you don't recognize the fallacies in the fine tuning argument and you think everything is balanced on a razor's edge for life, right? It's simpler to just say that's all a brute fact. Anything you introduce to try to explain that would need a fine tuning explanation even more, and you're worse off, right?
Yeah.
I think that argument is good. I think that's
sure.
got the sticking point to it.
3 quick things. One, I want to say thank you to Secular Rarity for donating.
Yes, thank you.
I always enjoy your talks, Season Mike.
Going to McDonald's. Woo!
So, thank you so much for that. Also, this made me laugh. My piano guy is a fine tuner.
Yeah.
Which is on fire tonight. I wanted to just add to that conversation real quick that even if I was to somehow accept the misrepresentation from the theist that if we were to change the constants even 1 iota, that everything would be different, that doesn't even remotely suggest intention. Like, all they're doing is saying this improbable event is improbable, and any universe being what it is would have a low probability of being what it is. And any new universe where you change its constants would, by definition, become an entirely different universe. So, like, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't remotely suggest anything other than a fact about changing constants. It doesn't tell us, it doesn't illuminate anything about how the universe actually came to be.
Yeah, you're saying there's no inference rule that gets you.
There's no
that,
inference.
Like, on top. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Yeah.
This is something similar to what Manson talks about. Manson also has a bit where he talks about the multiverse and whether the multiverse is an answer to the fine tuning argument and that kind of stuff. And this is not exactly the same, but he makes a kind of argument where the question about could our universe have been different, maybe even nonsensical, because if the dials had been set different, that wouldn't be this universe, that'd be a different universe.
Yeah, sure,
right. And so like, you know, it's roughly put, it's kind of saying that it might be that the values that the constants have in our universe are part of its essence. It's part of its nature. They couldn't have been different, right? In a certain kind of way. So go to it's Neil Manson. That's what it is. The name just came to me. Cool. Go to Neil Manson's paper, The Anti-Fine Tuning Argument. He talks about that in all grand detail. He also lays out a very good reason for thinking that the probabilities that are expressed in the fine tuning argument are either meaningless or they're worthless.
Sure. Right. Because that's what I think as well. Yeah,
because either you're saying there's a 1 in infinity chance that they had the right value. 1 in infinity is a meaningless, proposition, right? That's a meaningless probability, right? Or you have to give it a finite value, but then how far do you limit that finite value?
Something with an actual integer is what,
right?
What you're, yeah.
But how far do you limit it, right? Well, that's just a completely arbitrary choice.
Gotcha.
And if you limit it really wide, the chances are low. I could limit it really low, and the chances are high. There's no right or wrong way to do it or whatever. And so the probabilities expressed in the argument are either meaningless because it's 1 in infinity, or they're worthless because they're arbitrary.
And also, another thing is, why the hell would an immaterial God need to create a material existence?
That
makes no sense to me.
Yep. William Rowe, and I forget the title of the paper off the top of my head, but William Rowe has a really good argument about like freedom and God's, like freedom and God, can God be free, that kind of stuff. And half of that paper is about God's creative nature. Can he create freely? And one of the interesting things that he points out is that the only way that we could say that God freely created the universe would be if we thought that a universe existing or a universe not existing at all are just morally equivalent. They're each is just basically the same. And so God could choose between those two and not be doing a best or worse thing, right? If having a universe is better than not having anything at all, God created of necessity. He could not create. He couldn't not create. He had to because he must do the best.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then you have the problem. Well, if he must do the best, he must have created the best world. He must have created the best world, right? Which clearly this world isn't the best world. But B, is it even possible for there to be a best world? And so there's this other thing called the problem of best worlds that I've written on. That's really interesting. So maybe we could get into that another time. But
yeah, and
the problem of no best world is fun.
And watch them commit to like, well, this is the best possible world, and you're like, okay, so exactly this many amount of Jews should have died in the Holocaust, not one less, not one. Like it's like. It's just a really weird entailment that this was the best possible world. It's like, I can tell you that one less person dying in this event would have been a better one, and you're going to have to swallow the bullet. But anyway, yeah, I know you're probably over your time. I want to say in regards to probabilities that we have a high probability that shows with Professor David's, because we've had 2 now, have been very successful and extremely fun. I'll have to say, this David's giving your brother a run for his money, man. These 2 guys are great guests to have on. I want them to come back on and duke out, and you guys change my mind which of the David I prefer. But that's just going to be my excuse to have you both on consistently.
I would love to have you both at the same time as well.
That would be amazing. Yeah, that would be
is that your brother, Cease? Is he talking about your brother that does the physicist?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
I'm really interested in having you back, because I definitely love this conversation, and I'd like to get more into notions about value and how that may translate into meta-ethics.
Sure, yeah, because we didn't get into much meta-ethics today. So
I felt like we did pretty well for the time. So
but there's definitely a lot more to unpack there. I feel like we just scratched the surface there.
Sure.
And I think that would be a definitely interesting conversation to have. So I'll definitely stay in touch, and we'll figure out when you can come back. And
sounds good to me. I'd be glad to be halved back. Is that the right way to say that?
Yeah.
Well,
thanks so much for.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to give you one last chance to plug anything that you like, especially with things we went over with books, things like that, and again, to allow people where they might be able to go to pick those things up, because I know I'm going to be going to Amazon. So
yeah. Very welcome, right? So very welcome to do that. So the biggest thing is my great courses. I have 3 of them with the great courses. It's Exploring Metaphysics, The Big Questions of Philosophy, and then Sci-Fi, Science Fiction as Philosophy. If you like the pop culture, go for the sci-fi. If you like the heady God stuff that we've been talking about, go with metaphysics. I also talk about that in the Big Questions. If you'd like a nice introduction to the major questions of philosophy, that's what the Big Questions of Philosophy is for. You can get that on going to thegreatcourses.com. You can find all of those things on Amazon, either in DVD or audio format or downloadable format. They're audiobooks. There's also something, it used to be called the Great Courses app. It's now called Wonderium, I believe. Mm-hmm. Let me look at my phone here. Wonderium is what it's called. So you can go to the Wonderium app, and that's essentially their Netflix. So if you do like a monthly subscription, you get a month for free. You could listen to my courses for a month, right? And unsubscribe if you wanted to, but they're all there. If you I don't think that the metaphysics course is on Wonderium, but the other 2 are, because they've got video and that kind of stuff. And if you watch them, you can see all my cool ties and vests and that kind of stuff. If you actually watch them on the Wonderium app, I have quite a collection. So that's my great courses. In regards to my books, my latest stuff is, so 10 years ago was Inception in Philosophy right there. But then of course, right next to it right there is Black Mirror in Philosophy. Again, that is a book and an audiobook. You can also get it on Kindle. And then the one I haven't shown you yet, is Exploring the Oroville, which is a book that I edited on the show The Oroville, which I'm a big, huge fan of. And if anybody's a fan out there, you will be happy to see that. You will see right here that Seth MacFarlane, the creator himself, wrote a very nice long review of the book that's on the back of it, and it is glowing.
Awesome. That is amazing.
He had really nice things to say about it. If you look this up online, it's really easy to find what he actually wrote there.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Was
lucky enough that he actually saw an advanced copy of the book and was very complimentary and was kind of like, he was very proud that like what he was trying to do with the show was inspire this kind of book and this kind of thinking and this kind of work on it. And so we were very happy to have that. In fact, Andre Bormanis, who is one of the producers of the show, wrote the foreword for the book as well. And that's kind of how I got in with Seth.
Sweet.
I've never talked to Seth directly. I went through his secretary, but
that's still a claim to fame if you have one. I'll say that. That's awesome. I'm really, you definitely pumped me up to read your work. So I'm extremely excited to order some books. So
great.
It's funny because I have a giant backlog of things that I haven't gotten to yet, but like I'm gonna just skip that and go to yours because I'm like, after this conversation, I'm very, especially like a lot of things you lay down, I'm like, I think the exact same, or at least a lot of those arguments and criticisms are my own. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts and then see where we actually disagree. So that would be really cool.
Cool. If you're into science fiction, I'll last plug the Sci-Fi and Philosophy course is a lot of fun, because what I do it's 24 lectures. At the end of each lecture, I say, go and watch this thing and then come back and we'll talk about it. And then I have a 30-minute lecture. We talk about it. And then I say at the end of that one, I say, go watch something else. I got something else for you to watch. Go watch that. Come back. And it can be kind of like this fun journey through science fiction. And we go all the way back to Metropolis, like the 1920s, 30s, whatever movie. Metropolis. There's stuff from the 90s. There's stuff from the 80s. There's recent stuff. One of my favorite ones is on Starship Troopers. Do Star Wars, Doctor Who, AI, artificial intelligence, 13th
Star
floor.
Trek's in there. I'm sold. So.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of Star Trek. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and Star Trek comes up in a number of different lectures, and then there's at least 2 lectures that are kind of dedicated to Star Trek. One where I talk about multiple universes, and you will see that I do an evil Spock thing. Like if you're watching the visual thing, there's a visual gag that doesn't come across on the audiobook where I'm actually pulling off like
that's great,
an evil Spock kind of a thing. And I'm like in an alternate universe, and you have to be watching careful for it. But if you're watching for it, you'll see it. Lots of fun.
Well, that's great. It sounds like you have a lot of passion in what you do, and we appreciate you sharing that with us and our audience. And I would be very humbled to have you come back and share more with us and have this conversation. So thank you.
Anytime.
Thank you for giving us our time, and I'll let Cease close that out while I get the close ready. By the way, David, there'll be a countdown. Feel free to just exit out whenever. No need to sit through the countdown. But yeah, thank you again, and hopefully we'll be in touch.
All right. Well, then I'll say good night, and thanks for having me on. Just email me, Cease, and we'll set up something
definitely. else. We'll stay in touch. Thanks again.
Cool.
But so that was great. The last thing I'll say is, I'll probably will come back for another episode. What I think we said Friday. Yeah,
we should be doing one Friday. There's a chance we could have 2 on Friday. I might do the review in the daytime while CC Boy here is sleeping. But maybe I'll do it when he's awake or not.
I can.
Part of me wanted to have one. I don't want to. I want to do this on a night I don't have to work the next day. Part of me wants to do like a drink some whiskey and watch that, because I don't know if I'll be able to get through it without some alcohol. And I think it'll be even more entertaining for the viewer to see a tipsy J Mike talk about it. So leave me something in the comments if you want to see that, and I'll do it.
I'll just say about that conversation, like I did make a couple of mistakes as far as like kind of humoring him too much, but I kind of try to do that just because I want to give them as many toys to play with as I can. But he's really, that whole conversation was a very good example of what happens when somebody doesn't take reasoning seriously.
Are you talking the debate? The debate.
Yeah, there's someone who doesn't understand what a non sequitur is. Like I kept trying to tell him, like, everything you've just said, every claim you've made about how the 7-day cycle came to be, could be true, and it doesn't suggest that the only implementation of it must have come from a supernatural thing. And he was just incapable of grasping this, and it's ironic. It's always the most ignorant that are the most arrogant.
Sure.
And I see that constantly on TikTok.
I don't even get me started on that. That's a cesspool of.
Same thing with Discord and in general, and just like people who really haven't actually put in the work to educate themselves and to really become aware of how little they know are the ones that's talked loudest and barked the loudest, but without actually having much content there. So I will give him credit. Like, he was definitely louder than me in stating his position.
I'll be the judge of the loudness and whether or not it annoys me out of the stream. Well, it would be cool to be part of that review. I'll see if I can get up early enough. Yeah, well, maybe we'll just do it that Friday night, or we'll do it in the day or some other day. So we'll leave it open, but just expect an episode on Friday around the same time, usually around 7 to 8. And then I'll issue like a notification or something like that for a live stream with like a countdown if I do it early and get people gathered in. So yeah, just be tuned on that, fine-tuned, if you will, and just let me know if you want that Drinks with J. I know Witter does it. Drinks with J Mike. I'm not going to make it a series because I'm not going to kill my liver like that. But for certain debates like this, yeah, I might have to get through a whiskey just to get through it. Again, thank you everybody that tuned in and watched the show. Really appreciate David coming on again. Cease deserves all the credit here for contacting and getting David on the show. I had nothing to do with it at all. It was actually a pretty pleasant surprise for me. And so don't even say next morning is Java with J Mike, because I'm taking Java 3, and like, yeah, so I don't even want to hear the word Java right now. But anyway,
I was just gonna say that debate with that crazy guy made me want to drink, and I don't drink. That's
yeah. But, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone, for always tuning in. And if you like what we're doing, like and subscribe, and with the links to Patreon and everything. Yeah.
We always forget to say that. Yeah, if you want to subscribe, it doesn't cost you anything. Please do that. And then also, if you want to support us directly, you can do so. Secular Rarity supported us with a donation. You can do that. You can also support us on patreon.com/Axioms on Trial. All of that money goes directly to our stomachs and gear and things like that. So there's no ambiguity where that goes. It helps us out. Things like that. So yeah, anyway, yeah, just guys, if you want to see that episode, leave it in the comments. And if there's like 3 comments by the end of this that say do the episode, I'll do the episode with whiskey. But maybe not Friday. Maybe I gotta go buy whiskey and whatnot. But anyway, guys, peace out, much love, and stay critical.